Editorial note. Not many outside of the Inquisition and higher-ranking members of the Administratum know of the true nature of the great enemy. The ruinous powers of chaos are not united and in fact tend to be broken into 4 factions that have as much resentment for each other as they do for us. Citizens of His Divine Majesty's Imperium who are aware of this truth often use this as evidence of our superiority over them. Indeed, the Ordo Hereticus has, on more than a few occasions, pointed out that this is the greatest weakness of the chaotic forces that we might exploit for our victories. But it feels rather hypocritical for us to say such, as the more I look at our own worlds and peoples, we are just as much divided. Even we in the Inquisition cannot say we trust everyone in our ranks. Aside from Amberley and a few others I've worked with in the past, I hardly trust other Inquisitors any more than I do a common stranger, as will be made apparent later. Perhaps the divisions we see in the forces of chaos are not so different from the divisions humanity crafts for itself. I acknowledge this because I need to explain the division and background of the world of Heathmore, and it would be far too easy and simple to scoff at the division and harsh contrasts in beliefs and cultures that the people of this primitive world possess without first acknowledging that we in the Imperium are just as guilty of such menial trifles. In the world of Heathmore, there are 4 primary factions that make up the warring peoples of Heathmore. They are the Knights of Ashfield, the Vikings of Valkenheim, the Samurai of the Myre, and the Wu Lin of an unknown empire. The Knights will seem quite familiar to any of us within the Imperium as being very similar to us in both mindset and armament and distinction. They possess the more spacious and fertile lands in Heathmore, and their people clad themselves in steel plate armor that is reminiscent of medieval armor of our ancestors. Swearing themselves to a code they call chivalry, the Knights of Ashfield hold both their honor and their pride upon their shoulders. All take oaths to fight for peace, which I admit is a laughable oath, considering many of their number seek to incite war in the first place. Indeed, I came to learn that it was a knight known only as Apollyon who engulfed Heathmore in an even greater conflict in only a few short years. Regardless of this, the knights hold fast to a strict and even religious doctrine that holds their souls sacred to a higher power not unlike ours to the Emperor of Man himself. It is their valor and piety that drives them ever forward in their duties to their people and their will. Now the Vikings, at first glance, would appear not unlike cornate cultists. They are savage and brutal people in appearance, wearing minimal armor and leaving themselves wild in both manner of speech, action, and appearance. In fact, I recall a few of them called shamans who fought more like wild animals than a person. Yet their barbaric exterior appearance masks a true regalness that takes a discerning eye to notice. The Vikings have grown quite hardy thanks to the icy and mountainous lands that they call home, and they make the most of what is given to them, as their strength comes from years upon years of battling both enemies and the elements themselves. Their religious faith seems to revolve around a pantheon of deities who they call the Aesir. I investigated this faith deeply before presenting this information to ensure that they were not demons of the warp or worse, chaos gods themselves. And I have found, thankfully, this not to be the case, thank the Emperor. In fact, it appears to simply be a paganistic faith built on superstition and chance, although, and to be fair, perhaps there's a degree of truth in it, as they speak occasionally of a world serpent they call Jormungandr, and life readings on the planet have detected a quite large creature matching such a description beneath the waves of Heathmore. Further study is indeed needed for confirmation of this, however. The samurai are a baffling people, in contrast to the other two. When I first encountered their kind, I was amazed by their attention to artistic detail, beauty, and balance. I hardly saw them as warriors as much as I did merchants and artisans. How one could take a simple god and make it a lavish place of meditation is something I had not ever considered personally, and yet it was as common to the samurai as if it were natural to any man. Because to the samurai, I found, balance and harmony are essential to life. Their religious faith is not so much one of deities and legalistic rules, but rather a belief in life and value in all things in nature. The spirits that reside within all things, or kami as they are called, hold both power and reverence to the samurai. In fact, I might go so far as to say they remind me of tech priests, only with a clear absence of augmetics. And finally are the Wu Lin, who bear a striking similarity to the samurai in their faith and outlook on the world, but make up for these similarities with an attention to martial zeal. It could be stated with no small degree of accuracy that the Wu Lin seem to understand warfare on a higher level than any of the other factions. I say this not because they are superior fighters or warriors, but because they have established a commanding presence in Heathmore while still maintaining a relatively minor physical presence. They do not lay claim to any specific territory within the wider world, and yet their presence is felt by all of the other factions as they set up cities, castles, and temples throughout the land. Such brash and challenging actions could only be done by those with the strength and might to merit such brashness, and this they do well. They are the only faction to have any weapons resembling firearms, primitive though they might be, and they also manage to take what appear to be little more than sticks and staves and make them deadly weapons. For some of my readers, I'm sure the information I've shared must seem superfluous in the context of these logs. However, I feel it is very important that we understand who these cultures are as potential citizens of the Imperium, for this will be a first founding, in a sense. For the lands of Heathmore, the wider galaxy has had little to no impact on their people. They have never been graced by the visitation of our warships, nor have they been cursed with the arrival of our enemies, until the events of this archive, of course. It is for this reason that the events that follow in this archive will be of absolute significance to us of the Ordo Xenos, and for the Imperium at large. Our wars with the forces of Orcs, Necrons, Tau, Eldar, both free of taint and corrupted, as well as the Tyranids and Chaos Cultists, are never-ending, and always bringing us to the point of extinction. Our survival is attributed in no small part to the might of the Emperor and the unyielding will of mankind. While the strength of his glorious majesty is certainly not in doubt, we must consider that the will of man is not unbendable. If it were, then the cultists of chaos could not so easily persuade mankind to their ruinous designs. So how then, we must ask, will a civilization of humans, unaware of the Imperium and its history, fare when faced with an alien foe such as the Orcs, a race that we of the Imperium have ourselves been forced to acknowledge as a deadly threatening foe? This archive should be seen as both a documentation of the events of Heathmore, but also the results of an experiment on the true will of mankind, and I believe you'll find the results rather shocking, to say the least. But I must apologize now, as I've allowed myself to indulge in my love of speech long enough. The first few chapters of this archive are from my own perspective, as I was a simple acolyte of the Inquisition at the time, and thus the narrative will be told from this vantage point. I will on occasion interject to add editorial points where I see it necessary to do so. Other than that, I will let the archive speak for itself. Joseph Corvan, Ordo Xenos. Chapter 1. First Landing. Inquisitor Sablan was not a man who smiled. To be honest, I don't think I recall many Inquisitors smiling, at least not the ones I'd met. But if the man had any sense of humor to him, I saw it on his face only 4 times in my life, and 2 of them were on the same evening. The evening in question began with us watching from the viewport of the star cruiser Indomitable, as we watched the flaming hulk of a space garbage that Orcs referred to as ships go screaming to the planet below in a heap. I had been beside myself, you can be sure. I had relished the sight of an Orc ship being battered and decimated by the bombardment from the ship, and I pumped my fist once in exultation, only for a sharp glare from Sablan to meet me, which quieted me down quickly. "Do not partake in that disgraceful action," he hissed at me, taking note of a few of the guard troopers around us already cheering the destroyed craft as I had. "The fools do not realize the battle is not over." I was a bit taken aback by this, of course. From where I was standing, it seemed the Orc shuttle was destroyed. It would crash on the planet, and that would be the end of it. But at that point, I knew little about the Orc species and their resilience. I also didn't know anything about their reproductive capabilities. An editorial point I should make here. Orc reproduction abilities are a highly studied phenomenon in the Ordo Xenos. Orcs do not reproduce through intercourse as humans, Eldar, and Tau do. Instead, their bodies produce spores that seep into the ground and begin growing into a new batch of Orcs ready for battle within a decade or 2. It's this trait that makes Orcs so difficult to purge from a world. Even if the Orcs are killed, their bodies can still leave spores that will breed a new generation to start the process over again. That's why exterminatus is often the quickest and most effective way to terminate an Orc infestation that can't be solved with a few dozen heavy flamers. But I digress, as many in the Ordo Xenos already know this information, and this is purely for those who were speculative. Inquisitor Sablan did though, and give a tut from his teeth. That I'd learned from the 4 years I'd served under him was a good sign he was disgusted by something. He was disgusted by a lot, let me tell you. Whether it be the sight of a Xeno colony popping up on an Imperial world, or an Imperial Guard trooper with his helmet on crooked, Sablan was quick to correct the problem, usually through a very strict and brash means. It was his right to, of course. He was an Inquisitor, and my job was simply to do as he told me and try not to make him angry. And he was angry a lot. If the battle isn't over, sir, then what is left for us to do, sir?" I asked curiously. In a way of an answer, the Inquisitor turned his attention to the captain of our vessel, Captain Haran. The only female ship's captain I'd met, and, if I'm being honest, I was quite smitten with her after meeting her for the first time. Call it a scholar boy's crush if you will, but I can never forget those beautiful green eyes and those pouty lips, and that chestnut-brown hair that cascaded her face as if spring water from the top of her scalp. I'd often offered to run errands for her just so I could see her smile and thank me for my service. I always prayed to the Emperor Sablan never noticed, but he was an inquisitor, so of course he noticed, and, as was typical for Sablan, he tutted at it.
Captain, I require landing craft and at least a platoon of the Warhawks aboard this vessel.
The captain gave a nod, puffing out her chest to look as dignified and important as possible. Inquisitors get that a lot in my experience. Absolutely, sir. Any particular platoon you'd like to...
I require them to be armed with flamers, and that is all. I could care less about who comes.
He snapped, marching away from her.
Acolyte, we're going with them.
I felt a bit crestfallen having to leave the ship's bridge and away from those deep green eyes of Captain Haran, but gave the captain a respectful salute and did as told. Wish us luck, Captain, I cried, finding I too was puffing out my chest for her, much as she had done for Sablan. She smiled at me and returned my salute with a grin. Stay safe, Corvan, she instructed. I beamed and turned on my heels, chasing after Inquisitor Sablan's tail towards the landing craft waiting for us. Editorial note. Many of my fellow Inquisitors need no explanation or elaborate description about how dropships and orbital shuttles act and feel as they enter a planet's atmosphere. That said, I believe many might find it amusing that in my younger days I couldn't stand the sensation. It's not that I was motion sick by any means, but the jolting and bouncing of the ship as we cleared atmospheric barriers and crossed through storms, clouds, and turbulence always set me on edge, as if one of those shutters wasn't just shifting in pressure, but an explosion of a missile against the hull of our ship. That creaking was our ship breaking apart, and sure, it might seem silly to many, but remember I was barely a man at that point, still a juvie to many of my fellows and peers. And as I sat clutching the edge of my seat, my harness holding me in place, I clenched my eyes shut with each shock or shaking of the ship, whispering some obscenities that I didn't want to vocalize too loudly for Sablan to overhear. If he did hear them, he didn't say anything. He just sat stoic and tall as he always did, and there were honestly times it angered me the way he sat. I can't put into words why, I admit. There was something about his arrogance, the haughty attitude he portrayed, and the concentrated sneer on his face. It all reeked like a disgusting stench of mold. Of course, I voiced none of this back then. He was an inquisitor, and the most unspoken rule in the Imperium outside of the Emperor's omnipotence was to never get on the bad side of the Inquisition. I think that, at first, I admired his stoic indifference to everything around him, as though the troubles of the galaxy couldn't faze him. But after a few years, I grew to detest it, particularly after his decision made on Heathmore, but again, I get ahead of myself. Upon landing, the Warhawk Guard troopers rushed off, las guns raised and heavy flamers armed ready to fire. The Warhawks were drop troopers by speciality, and they were used to making sudden entrances and hitting the ground running, so by the time they were out and setting up a perimeter, I was still shuffling off behind Sablan. In my young hands I clutched a bolt pistol, because it was all Sablan would permit me to wield.
True warriors of the Emperor use their faith as their shield and their piety as their weapon, he would say.
I must admit, now that I look back on those words, I quite frankly wish I could have shoved my bolt pistol up his arse and pulled the trigger so I could ask where the warp his bloody shield of faith was then. But that's just my personal feelings on the matter. It now occurs to me just what an emperor botherer Sablan was, and that might have been why I resented him. Don't misunderstand, I have great piety and faith in the Emperor and his glorious designs for mankind, but there's something so distasteful and even irritating about so openly pious people that they walk to that thinly painted line between lunacy and devotion and start scrubbing away the paint. Sablan definitely was one of those. I stayed behind him all the same, and it didn't take long for us to find what we were looking for. The massive junk heap of the Orcs was only about 500 meters ahead, and giant fires and smoke poured from it like open wounds on a body, as it began scanning the area for signs of the greenskins. However, I saw nothing. It was odd, really. An Orc raiding party hits the ground without thinking of setting up perimeters and only looking for immediate targets. Quite often, like cornate cultists, they become so battle-hungry they don't even wait for their fellow warriors to join them and start rushing out blindly to make a kill. This often works to their disadvantage in prolonged fights, as guardsmen can pick off the early Orc attackers while they're barreling across the field. But here, there were none, not even around their ship.
"Sir," one soldier called, "I have movement in the tree line." It was then I realized that we were in a forest of some kind. I hadn't noticed it, as the orc ship had ripped away a large amount of trees and foliage to leave a large clearing, but around it were in fact trees and dense jungle-like foliage. The ground was wet and murky with swamp water, and I was suddenly aware of the thickness of the air like a bog. I heard Sablan tut again, but I couldn't tell if it was at the environment or the guard's statement.
"Then press forward. If it's the orcs, then purge the foul xenos from this world," he ordered. "Yes, sir," the guardsman shouted. "You heard the Inquisitors. Weapons sharp and stay focused. Let's hunt some greenskins." "Sir, yes, sir," they shouted in reply and began surging forward like a unit, covering each other with weapons trained ahead towards the tree line. They moved with methodical motions that would leave my mind staggering. It was as if they were one working unit with multiple pieces and parts. Now, I couldn't see the movement they had been talking about in the trees, but I did hear noises. The unmistakable sounds of shouting and roaring of orcs excited with bloodlust. But there was also something else. A language being spoken that was definitely not orcish, but not Gothic. It was fluid and refined, yet alien. And yet it felt somewhat familiar, as if it was somehow human. I heard more shouting, strange whistling sounds, and even orcs crying out in pain. "Sir," I whispered. Sablan didn't turn to face me, but I assumed he'd heard me. "Is this planet populated?" "By a primitive people who have no contact with the Imperium." He waved his hand dismissively. "They are not our concern."
"Well, yes, sir, but what if they found the orcs and are caught up in combat?" I asked. "We don't want to hurt innocent human civilians in the crossfire, do we?" Sablan finally shot a sneer back at me as if I was something he discovered on the sole of his boot. I bowed quickly and apologetically.
"The mission comes first, boy," he snarled. "Orcs are a festering and unyielding foe. If they set up a colony here, they will grow and overwhelm this world within a few decades, and this will provide the Wa another jumping-off point for their invasion of the sector. If a few primitive civilians have to die to prevent such an event, then so be it. It is for the good of the Imperium, as are all acts taken by the Inquisition and His Majesty's holy warriors."
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir," I squeaked weakly, afraid I'd upset him. I hadn't, of course. In fact, Sablan's response had been far more gentle than was normal for him. As I think back on the exchange, in fact, he even added a final note after my apology, which, as of now, with hindsight as my benefactor, I found rather ironic.
"In any case," he added, "the people of this world are so technologically removed from us, they won't stand a chance against an orc raiding party like this. They'll die in due course in either event."
There was a grain of truth in Sablan's prognosis, but what we found as we drew upon the sounds of the orcs shocked all of us in the expedition, including the crusty old Inquisitor himself. As we neared the sound of combat, we saw what we were looking for. At least 30 or 40 orcs standing around, shouting and grunting in frustration and anger. Around them were bodies of humans and other orcs. Some were burnt from the wreckage of the ship, and others were oddly injured, as if lacerated by combat blades. As we got close, the guard troopers near us got to work and opened fire from behind on the unsuspecting orcs. As greenskins' heads exploded into paste, others suddenly rounded on us and charged, letting out a mighty wah as they did. A few tried to fire off their blasters, but orc accuracy is incredibly poor, and we hardly even needed to find cover. In fact, most didn't even go for their guns, but instead yanked out axes and chain blades to fight up close. The orcs' preferred means of cutting down their enemies has always been in close quarters. But the guard troopers didn't falter and began cutting down the nearby army of greenskins as I joined in the fight as well, firing off a few rounds as they barked from my firearm and incapacitated the nearest orc to me by blowing its leg off at the knee. It let out a scream of agony, but continued to hobble towards me. It still amazes me even to this day the sheer tenacity of these creatures. These beasts are able to keep fighting even after the most horrendous of injuries, and will do all they can to spill blood before succumbing to them. It's both intriguing and horrifying, especially if you happen to be a young man with a bolt pistol facing your very first orc raiding party. I cowered back and fired a few badly aimed shots, one finally connecting with its head, killing it, at last, its head exploding into a pile of sick. I looked up from the dead beast, only to see the Warhawks were finishing up with their kills, cutting down the stragglers who had gotten enough common sense to try and find cover, only for them to be caught by fire from flamers, igniting them into running and screaming balls of flame. It made me feel a little sorry for myself, having only killed one orc, while the Warhawks had clearly done a much better job. But again, I was a juvie, and I request that you take that into consideration before questioning my battle honors. Sablan watched all this with his familiar and distinct sneer of distaste and minor disinterest.
"Filthy creatures," Can't they have the decency to die quietly? All that abhorrent screaming is unseemly.
Maybe they like to hear their own voices, sir, one warhawk laughed. A glare from Sablan yanked the smile from his face instantly and quickly coughed and returned to his duties. Search for survivors, and prepare to burn the bodies in the area around the wreck. Can't take any chances of another batch of these monsters growing here. As the unit moved out and began hunting for any survivors, I was busy glancing at the human bodies to see just who they were and what kind of primitive people lived here. They wore strange armor, nothing like the flak armor I was used to. This armor was organic, strong, but still not as strong as God Trooper armor. Their weapons were steel swords and at least one large wooden club with studs embedded in it. This one belonged to the largest one of the primitive people, with a girthy body and wearing a face mask with sharp teeth and tusks etched into it. Though he was dead, there was a frightening aura to his visage, and I couldn't help but stare at the orc body next to him. Its head pulverized by what I could only assume was the aforementioned club. A part of me wondered if this man was an unarmed Astarte soldier, but my better judgment ruled that out quickly. Note, with hindsight, this was one of the samurai class of warriors referred to as a shugoki upon further investigation.
Acolyte, come here at once, the Inquisitor shouted.
I didn't hesitate to drop my gaze from the warriors and run to his side. He was pointing at a few of the dead orcs, and his eyes were, for the first time since I'd met him, wide with surprise.
Look at these bodies. What are these?
I failed to notice anything at first, until Sablan indicated their heads. Wooden shafts protruding from them, with small bird feathers notched into the ends. I removed one and saw the tip was steel and sharp. This was an arrow, a primitive projectile weapon fired from a bow. These orcs were killed by archers, primitive bow archers. Weapons like these have never been used on orcs before, and even if they were, they'd hardly be able to puncture orc armor, I noted. And yet these arrows
were expertly fired, Sablan whispered, and with impeccable accuracy. And you of course noticed the other bodies. What does that show you, Corvan? He asked.
I thought it over for a moment, looking from the dead orcs to the dead human warriors with a defeated shrug. I didn't want to guess and be wrong about my assumptions.
I'm not sure, sir. Oh, think, boy, he barked. The humans here were too primitive to be a match for the orcs. That was obvious from the beginning. But despite their primitive nature, they were able to actually defeat these orcs in close-quarter combat. This is most unexpected.
Perhaps, I agreed, seeing his reasoning. It did make sense, but still the information didn't yield his motives. But what does that mean, sir? It was in that moment that Sablan did the unbelievable. He smiled. He actually smiled, a grin at me that sent a shiver down my spine. Some smiles show warmth and merriment, and in the case of the captain on the ship, that one makes me feel pleased and a little giddy like a schoolboy. But this smile, Sablan's smile, was one of absolute malice. He was hatching something, a plan I had no comprehension of, until it was far too late for me to intercede at any rate. But he never said a word to me. He just gave that grin.
Inquisitor, a warhawk shouted, returning a crisp salute. Sir, we've searched the area. No orc survivors around. We'll begin purging the territory to get rid of any spores. No, Sablan shouted.
The warhawks paused a moment and looked back at him with great confusion. Sir, even I was a little taken aback. This was the whole reason we'd come down here, right? To prevent an orc infestation. But now he didn't want us to burn the remains.
We're returning to the Indomitable, he ordered. Immediately. I have to meditate on something. This planet might prove more interesting than I expected. The Inquisition is placing this backwater world under quarantine until further notice. Now we're moving out. Double time.
I had no idea of the Inquisitor's motives, of course, and I was completely baffled by this decision not to burn the orc bodies. But when I was finally made privy to his intentions and his purpose for leaving the orcs' boards, the word livid doesn't come close to my sentiment. I was white with rage. Had he not been an Inquisitor and my superior, I might have considered reporting him for heresy and treason. But not only would this not come to pass, it would fall to me to finish his distasteful work. Irony is truly the Emperor's most precious toy, as the saying goes. Yet, for all this distaste and trepidation, I don't regret my activities on Heathmore in the slightest.